Tonight marks the 20th anniversary of the founding of Wat Metta. It was on October 12, 1990 that the land was first purchased. And it's good to reflect on how much we owe to the people who first thought up the idea of having this monastery, and the people whose gift of land and then the development of the land into a monastery have provided us with an opportunity to practice. And there are two themes that are worthy of reflection. First is Buddha saying, "Visasa Paramayati." Our foremost relatives are those we trust, or those for whom we feel trust. This is John Sawat, who first thought up the idea of having this monastery, the donor of the land. The people gave money and time and energy to get the monastery off the ground. They weren't related to us at all. And yet they had a sense of trust that this would be a good thing to do, this would be a good gift to give, and there would be people who would take good advantage of it. As the Buddha said, that kind of relation is much more important and much closer than our blood relations. You can think of a lot of the people you're related to for whom you don't have any trust at all, and the sense of relatedness is pretty weak. Whereas the people for whom you feel trust, that's a relatedness is very strong. That's that kind of relatedness that keeps the world going, gives us a sense that human society is a worthwhile thing. Which relates to another topic, which is that of gratitude. There's a saying that there are two people who are hard to find in the world. One are those who are called bupagardi, those who help you before you've even done anything to help them. And the other person who's hard to find is someone who's received that kind of help and feels gratitude in response. There's a lot of misunderstanding on the topic of gratitude. We get it confused with things like appreciation and contentment. An example of appreciation would be the story the Buddha tells about the man who has to cross over a river and realize he's going to need a raft, and so he makes the raft. Then swims across Independence on the raft. And then he gets to the other side. He says, "How useful this raft has been to me." That's a sense of appreciation. Without that raft, he wouldn't have gotten where he was. But because he appreciates the raft, it doesn't mean that he has to carry it around with him from then on. Pulls it up on land, or he sinks it down in the water, and then goes on his way. In other words, in appreciation, you realize that you have benefited from something, and it can be a thing. And yet the requirement for you to respond is pretty minimal. In case of something that you can continue to use, you take care of it. And then there are cases of really negative events in your life that help to turn you around. And even though it may have been something negative or something that someone did that was really nasty, but you benefited from it, you want to have an appreciation for the fact that sometimes you do benefit from misfortune. But it doesn't carry the lesson that you should give misfortune to other people so they could benefit. As for contentment, that simply means being happy with what you've got, realizing that you have good things and it's enough for the sake of the practice. And the good things don't have to be all that good, but they'd be good enough so that you don't have to keep scrambling for more. That's contentment. As for gratitude, that's more related to the teaching on karma. When the Buddha introduces the topic of gratitude, he does in the context of explaining karma. After saying that there are good and bad actions that lead to good and bad results. He then goes on to say there is mother and father, which sounds kind of like a non sequitur, and something perfectly obvious, except the fact that in those days there were people who said there is no such thing as mother or father, meaning that your parents just gave birth to you because they were forced to by forces larger themselves. Whoever created the universe decreed that they were going to give birth to you. There was no goodness on their part. And the fact they'd looked after you was again decreed by some outside force. So again, there's no goodness on their part. What this statement means, there is no mother or father, means that you don't owe them anything. And so when the Buddha said there is mother and father, that's what he meant, is that you do owe something to your parents. You owe a debt of gratitude, because they were able to make the choice of whether they were going to care for you or not. It was through their choices that they didn't abort the pregnancy, and they gave you the body you have, and they taught you about the world. They taught you how to walk, how to talk, how to speak. And regardless of how foolish they may have been in other ways, and the Buddha admits that there are parents who are stingy and unvirtuous and pretty ignorant. Even then, you owe a huge debt of gratitude for them, and of gratitude to them for what they've done. Because they may have to make some difficult choices. It's not an easy thing to raise a child or to give birth to a child. Yet they made the difficult choice. That's what marks the whole issue of gratitude. People make choices. When the Buddha talks about gratitude, the language he uses focuses on words that derive from the root for action, gar in Pali. There's Bupagari, the person who helped you to begin with, and that's the person to whom you owe a debt of gratitude. Someone literally means someone who acted first. And your response to that person should be that you are going to act in return, pati karoti. And even the word gratitude itself, gatanyu, means that you know what was done. You appreciate what was done. So it's not just a general appreciation, it's specifically appreciation for actions, and realizing that you have a debt that comes from that. There's something you have to do in return. Which means you have to return the goodness. And again, even though your parents may have been abusive, still, the Buddha says you try to repay them by teaching them, or at least being a good example for them. He says if your parents are stingy, you try to induce them to become more generous. If your parents are not virtuous, you try to induce them to be more virtuous. If they have no faith in the principle of action, you try to develop that sense of faith and conviction in them. And if they're not wise, you try to teach them the ways of wisdom. Again, of course, it's difficult to teach your parents. They don't like being taught by the children, but you can teach by example. That's one way of repaying the debt. But then there are cases when your parents are no longer around, or the people who helped you are no longer around. As in the case of Lumpu Sawat, who was the first to think up the idea that we should have this monastery here. So how do you repay your debt to him? Well, you think about his original intention. You try to maintain that intention, the goodness of his choice, the goodness of his ideas. You appreciate that goodness, and then you try to act in a way that extends that goodness throughout time, or further through time. In other words, the intention was to have a place where people could practice, quiet, secluded, with trees that we could sit under. Think about the time of the Buddha, who was born under a tree, gained awakening under a tree, gave his first sermon under a tree, passed away under a tree. To use Ajahn Suwat's phrase, the institution of Buddhism is established in the forest. So he wanted there to be a place where you could really be out in the trees, out in the wilds. It offers both the seclusion that's needed to practice and also some of the difficulties. You miss some of the conveniences of life in town here, or at least we don't have them. And it's a good test. If things were very comfortable and very easy and very convenient, you'd have no test against which to measure your greed, aversion, and delusion. But the hardships aren't so overwhelming that we can't practice. That's the whole point. So that was his intention for having this place. That's the meaning of the place. In order to maintain the meaning of the place, you want to keep practicing. There is that sense of indebtedness to the people who've made this possible, and so the best way to repay is to focus on the practice. In the Thai phrase that they started weaving something, and so you can continue the weaving. You don't let the edges get all frayed. And this is what gratitude is all about. It's a sense that not only that you appreciate the choices that people make, but you have a sense that you need to respond. The word bhattikaroti means to repay or to make amends, but it can also mean to imitate. In other words, you imitate the goodness that they have, the intention that they have. You try to carry that out. There's that question that people would often ask Ajahn Fuang, how can I repay you for having taught me? And his response was to be really intent on the practice. That's the best repayment right there. This is why the Buddhist teachings on gratitude are all surrounded by words that deal with action. You appreciate someone's good actions, and then you realize there's an action that's called for from you, an appropriate response. That's what makes it different from appreciation or contentment. And as the Buddha said, it's a characteristic of a good person to feel gratitude. And to want to repay that debt in one way or another. This is why Ajahn Fuang would often say if he saw someone who was ungrateful to his or her parents, he said, you don't want to have anything to do with that person. Because gratitude means that you appreciate goodness. You appreciate the difficulties that are involved in making the skillful choice, carrying it out. And when you appreciate that, you have gratitude for it, then it means you're more likely to make the same kind of effort yourself. So it's important you keep that distinction between gratitude on the one hand and attitudes like appreciation or contentment on the other. I was reading recently of someone saying that gratitude is wanting what you have. Well, it's more like contentment or appreciation. But gratitude is more focused. It's focused on actions, the actions you've benefited from, and then the actions that you are called on to make in response. To repay your debt of gratitude and to try to continue this stream of goodness into the world, on into the future. So all the benefits that have been entrusted to us will bear fruit, and they will show that we're worthy of that trust.